So, Jacob, I'm just going to start right off the bat with why do you like bathing in ice cold water?
Oh man, like is a very interesting word. I
Uh
don't
huh.
think it ever becomes comfortable, but yeah, it's just something that I have really connected with, mostly because there's so many transferable lessons I think in life from cold water that we can learn. And for me, it was kind of the gateway to learn those lessons. So primarily kind of going into cold water for me is like it's a stressful environment. So I'm deliberately putting myself into stress so that I can learn how to cope with that. And what I
Hmm.
take out from that is, when stress comes up in life is much easier to regulate, to handle that, to mindfully move through that. And I mean, there's so many other benefits that I enjoy, but I think primarily that's probably the main reason why I love it.
Yeah. Just
Yeah.
putting yourself in that uncomfortable state.
Yeah. Which I mean, I think that's so important that our
Uh-huh.
lives are so comfortable nowadays that we almost have to seek discomfort if we want to build that resiliency because we don't get that
Hmm.
really so much in our daily lives anymore as we used to.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I found that impacts pretty much everything in your life, right? The more comfortable you make your own life, it just gets easier and easier to seek out that comfort, right? And
Yeah, you get
when it
used.
comes to yeah, you get used to it. And when it comes to making a change or doing something different with your life, you really have to seek out ways to embrace that discomfort and get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Makes
Yeah,
sense.
no, you're absolutely right. The more that we like, what I find is the more that we remain kind of like quote unquote in our comfort zones, this kind of gets. It's like so a lot of people talk about ego, right? And when I talk about ego, I don't mean like the person who's super egotistical, who's all about, you know, me, which the ego is definitely about preservation of the self. But really, what the ego loves is comfort and the familiar. And,
Mhm.
it's impossible to get rid of the ego. It's really just a part of us. But the more that we remain in this comfortable way of life, we're feeding that ego. And anytime we get uncomfortable, it wants to take us back to the familiar. And so we really need to be mindful about, okay, this is just our ego who really wants to get back to what we know because it's about self-preservation, it's about being safe and understanding that and doing the thing anyway, which I think that's the hardest part.
Yeah, and lately, I don't know if you've gotten much into this whole AI phenomenon that seems to be getting more and more popular these days, but from the looks of it seems like there's going to be ways where we almost don't have to do anything ourselves at all, right? So I think it's important for us to constantly seek out these uncomfortable behaviors so that we're not all just, I don't know if you've seen that movie Wally, but we're all
Oh
just
yeah.
kind of like sitting in these chairs with screens and doing nothing all day.
I can remember exactly when I watched that movie and seeing it's like towards the end of the movie where everybody is just they're lack of a better term, extremely unhealthy. They're kind of laying in these types of beds that are on an incline and they're getting fed, they're not moving. And I just thought to myself, like, oh, that's never gonna happen, back then.
Yeah.
And with everything, like the trajectory of, yeah, like you said, technology, AI, and just what I see with, not to be doomsday because we do have so much control and I think there's a really a bright future ahead, but it's very easy to fall into the trap of becoming more and more docile because everything is automated in our lives.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, I'm a personal trainer. This is a podcast for our clients and anyone really who wants to improve their health in general. Why is it important for people to kind of get used to getting outside of their comfort zone?
Well, I mean, change does not happen unless you become uncomfortable. Like those two things don't coexist. Like
Mhm.
growth doesn't happen without being uncomfortable. So if somebody's super comfortable, not even super comfortable, someone's just comfortable and they're wanting to grow and make changes, if they don't feel uneasy, if they don't feel like, okay, this is a bit unfamiliar, if they don't step into the unknown, then no growth happens. So really like simple, like if somebody's going to grow, they're going to be uncomfortable. If they're not, they're just going to stay the same. There's no growth that happens otherwise.
So, in addition to, sitting in ice water, are there any
Yeah.
other ways that you strive to make your life a little bit more uncomfortable to get used to that feeling?
I don't know if there's so really it's like for me, it's a specific like day by day mindfulness practice.
Hmm.
So it's like when opportunities arise to be uncomfortable, and I'm not saying be risky to risk your life, like nothing like that. I'm saying just genuinely being uncomfortable. So for example, I was recently in Poland at a retreat. There was about 300 people there, and I was asked to teach the science for the Wim Hof method.
Hmm.
The initial reaction I had was, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to do it. Why do I need to do that? It's terrifying. And it's just much easier not to do it. Right. Like no one was putting the pressure on me or anything like that. It was just asking, like, would you mind doing this? And so before I sent an email response saying no, I'd rather not find somebody else, I just sat with it for a few days and thought about it. And what it was another opportunity for me to be uncomfortable in a really safe way and to challenge myself. And so I think we all have examples of that in our lives every single day, and we shy away from it. Whether
Hmm.
it's somebody who, somebody who is single, for example, and see somebody they might want to talk to and they don't do it because they're afraid. They're afraid of rejection or whatever it is. And taking that initiative, regardless of what the result is stepping into your discomfort zone, so to speak. We have these examples every single day. Life just gives them to us. We don't always have to seek it out, like go into an ice bath. We just need to be more mindful and not like what happens is we get into this mode. It's, autopilot. We just kind of run on autopilot, which is our unconscious way of living. And it's every day, it's very easy and we are predictable and everything like that. And so we aren't even aware of some opportunities sometimes or what we're doing. So it's
Hmm.
really just about bringing that awareness to your everyday life and realizing that you have a lot of opportunities to be uncomfortable. And we just kind of have been trained not to take them.
Yeah. And like you said, how it's kind of like a daily choice. And these opportunities we don't even recognize. But sometimes it is kind of conscious, isn't it? Because
And but yeah.
we choose to sit in front of the TV and watch Netflix at the end of the day over other more uncomfortable alternatives. And, in the cases of people coming in to see us as personal trainers or you in terms of your life coaching that you do, these are people that want to make a change in their life and their overall lifestyle. For the most part, people do know what they have to do to make those changes, but it's just for whatever reason, they can't get out of that pattern that they put themselves
Yeah, making that shift, like you said, we so often know what to do, but we don't do it.
in. Mhm.
And this just opens up a much deeper conversation, which I mean, we could probably talk for hours about this, but there's going to be like some either self-sabotage type of patterns, there's going to be limiting beliefs, and those also could be very connected. It could be that we are creatures of habit and we have just become so ingrained in our current way of living that our nervous system is operating in this way naturally. And to get out of that, it takes effort, no matter what the reason is. Like I always come back to this, no matter what the reason is that we are having difficulty making change. We can make excuses. We can look at our past, to look at our limiting beliefs. We can look at all these things, no matter what the reasons are. At the end of the day, the onus is on us to just make the change, regardless of what the reasons are. And that's the hard part is doing that. And because it's hard is why so many people are stuck in old ways of being. Because when we naturally are, like I mentioned, our egos before, our egos seek comfort and basically are adverse to pain or suffering or discomfort. And so since we are so averse to discomfort, we will naturally just continue to go down our own path. And it takes like really deliberate action to get out of that. Everyone in any moment, and I don't mean to say this in a way that comes across as, not empathetic to the struggles people go through, because I know how hard it is to make a change, especially when it's been a way we've been operating for years and years and years. But still, it takes that deliberate effort to actually make a change and put yourself first. And there's no one else that's going to do that for you, no matter how hard it is.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, and I want to go back to those limiting beliefs that you were mentioning. And
Hmm.
I think it kind of ties into identity as well, right? We all kind of put labels on ourselves and kind of stick ourselves in this little box. And for whatever reason, it kind of prevents us from escaping that box and maybe pushing ourselves outside of our comfort zone, right? Because, oh, I can't do that because, that's a different person. That's not me. Do you see that as well? And like, what's the first step in trying to get ourselves outside of that box that we've put ourselves
Yeah, I think no, that's a great question. So, limiting beliefs generally come from predominantly our childhood,
in?
and even more so predominantly between the ages of 0 to 8 when we are most influential, but definitely we create more as we go even into our 20s. And they're mostly from our parents, and this is not to say our parents did a bad job, but no parents get it right because generation by generation, unresolved trauma, unresolved issues get passed on to kids, and that just happens because it's the nature of how we are. Like if someone hasn't dealt with their things, they are going to act a certain way. The child sees that and learns from that, and then they also adopt those things. So it's not to say parents are doing a bad job. It's just that there's a lot of unaddressed trauma going on in the entire world. Every
Mhm.
single person has trauma. I've never met one person who has not experienced trauma. We develop these limiting beliefs, and like you said, those keep us in this small box, right? So here's the question. It's like, well, firstly, we need to bring awareness to what those limiting beliefs are. So, first comes awareness, then comes acceptance, and then comes action. That's kind of the three steps that I take when I work with anybody. It's like, let's bring some awareness in terms of where I'm limiting myself and what those beliefs are. And then we can start to look at the situations that brought those on. Where did I learn this from? So maybe if you think back at your childhood, you have this happened to me when I started doing this kind of work, especially what you call inner child work. I had never remembered this, but then I had this distinct memory of being in my crib as a child and crying and crying and crying and not having anybody come to me. And so people will think, okay, well, I was just a small child. I hardly even remember that. It doesn't stick with me today. Those things definitely stick with you. And when a child is crying like that, that's the only way they have to express to their parents that they're stressed. So either you are tired, you're hungry, there's something going on that you need to get your parents' attention. And so when you that goes ignored, you learn something very profound about the relationship you have with your parents and about love in that case. And so it's very likely that a child who even just one time, but think about a child who multiple times where the parents let their kids cry, 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 if that happens, that child is learning that they are unworthy, that they are unlovable, that when they need help, that no one's going to be there. And so then they carry that on into childhood. Okay, so now we know that. There's this saying that one of my old coaches had said to me before, and it goes like this: there's no inherent meaning in any experience. Okay, so that means if I break my leg, that's going to suck for me, but for you, it's probably not really going to mean anything, right? If there was an inherent meaning in that, that means we would all have the same feeling about it. So no experience has any inherent meaning. We're all going to basically take from that and apply our own meanings to it based on what our life experiences are. So then the question is, okay, we know where our limiting beliefs come from. We know what happened. So now we need to start switching the meaning we've given to those things. And if we can do that, then we can really powerfully shift those limiting beliefs. So, for example, if I look back to when, my parents didn't pick me up that time in the crib, I don't know if that was the only time, that's the only time I remember. But if I go back to that and I start to think, okay, so the meaning that I've been carrying is that, you know, sharing how you feel, which as a baby, you're sharing how you feel by crying, is going to go ignored. It's not worthy of attention. If I carry that belief, then I can look back at that and say, actually, you know what? Just because they didn't come to me doesn't mean they didn't love me. Just because they didn't come to me doesn't mean that I wasn't worthy. And I can go on to say possibilities of what the reason could have been why they didn't come to me. to shift that script a little bit. And we can all do this with all the experiences in our lives, but it takes deliberate effort to go to our childhood and our previous memories to start shifting those memories on our own.
I think that can be tied to focusing on things that are under your own control, right? So you
Yeah,
can't control other people's actions. So how long it took for your parents to come attend to you when you were a child, but you can kind of change how you framed that situation, like you mentioned. So yeah, you could have
exactly.
said, "Oh, they were ignoring me. They don't love me," but they could have been busy. It just took a little longer for them to get to you, right? So yeah, we have that control, that ability to choose how we view the situation and frame it in either a negative way or something more neutral.
Yeah, absolutely. And 99% of the time, what we perceive to be the reason is not the reason for something.
Yeah.
It's always, we always think things are way worse than they actually are. I mean, that's a general comment. Like, it's not always the case, but more often than not, like, just think about your own life. Like, when you think about something, how bad it's going to be, we stress ourselves out so much about something before it even happens, and it's usually not as bad as we think. So we
Mhm.
typically will think about the worst possible outcome in situations and apply the worst meanings to it when there could be a million others in that situation.
Yeah, and I was taking a look at your Instagram to kind of prepare for this chat. And something that you say a lot is we're so focused on kind of like attaching too much value into how other people view ourselves, right? And that's kind of like another barrier holding us back into wanting to change. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that's what everybody else think as well. We're all too absorbed with what's going on in ourselves to kind of even pay attention to what other people may be thinking about us. Yeah, I see a lot with people coming into the gym. A lot of times they get nervous about even going to the gym because they're worried about how other gym goers might be paying attention
Hmm.
to how they don't know what they're doing because they've never been before and all that. It's all these barriers and stories that we make up for ourselves to kind of prevent us from doing something.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think so. The thinking or caring about what other people think about us, the simple question you have to ask yourself in that case is, who are you living for?
Mhm.
Right? If we are walking around, which again, most of what I say is easier said than done. So just know I have that understanding. And I'm not saying these things thinking that change is easy. When we live for other people and we care daily about what other people think, and that we live to appease them, we live to maintain a certain identity with these people, then we are living for them and we're not being our true selves. Okay. So now when people say, I want to be the best version of myself, well, if you aren't showing up daily as your true authentic self, how could you ever be the true best version of yourself? Those two things don't go together. The only way you ever reach or can ever have the potential of reaching your full potential is if you're showing up as actually yourself every day. And I hope that makes sense because it's a really important point that, when people start to go down the personal development path and maybe hire a coach or a therapist or whatever, it's really important that if you're doing this work to basically, to a certain degree, reach your full potential, whatever that means for you, you really need to set a strong foundation. And that is just being yourself. And as simple as that sounds, so many of us don't do it.
All right. So let's go back a little bit now. So, Jacob, how did you go from being a lost kid in his 20s to now someone who helps people get unstuck and make the changes that they want to make in their
Well, it wasn't a linear path, that's for sure.
never ends?
No, it's not. So, yeah, what I realized was, well, let's go back. So, I was living very heavily, like we were just talking about actually, for the validation of others. So everything I did was to appease somebody, to seem good to other people. I had to be the best at whatever I was doing, or else I just didn't try in that specific thing. And so in a sense, I was also keeping myself very small and I was living for other people. I was doing a lot of partying. I was, just working whatever job I could just to have money for the weekend to basically escape reality. I was extremely disconnected from myself. I didn't have much substance. I didn't have many goals. And it seemed normal to me. So I didn't actually realize how much I was hurting because the people I hung out with, we were all in the same wavelength. We were all doing the same thing. And it seemed normal. And this is one of the big points is that we all, like you mentioned before, keep ourselves in these small boxes. And that small box ends up becoming normal eventually.
Mhm.
And that was my normal. And so I was definitely hurting within, but I never slowed down enough to listen and to pay attention and to see what was going on. And the large reason for that was I was terrified of vulnerability. I was terrified of sharing myself, my emotions. So it was much easier for me to put on this strong facade and to ignore myself. Fast forward a few years, I met somebody who was probably the most aware and awake person I had met up to that time. And she's only grown since then. And like well before her years. So, she started all this, whatever you want to call it, the personal development stuff at like the age of 16. Like when I was, that I started drinking at 14. So I was definitely not in the mindset of doing any kind of personal development at 16, that's for sure. And so she had started all this stuff so young. And when I met her, it was a huge wake up call. So what happens often in life is people are mirrors for us. Okay. So we meet somebody and they trigger us in some way. Okay, so we often will say that trigger is because they did something and I don't like it. Triggers are very often a reflection for what you don't like about yourself. And so I was fairly triggered, but also we were in a relationship and I love her and it was great. But I was also triggered because I saw how she was living and how in flow and authentically and how real she was, which I was very not used to. And I looked at how I was living and I was basically a shadow version of myself. So that was a hard pill to swallow. And at that point, I had a couple choices. I could either leave the relationship and continue how I was, which was the easy way to go. And this is kind of where this was probably the first time in my life that I did something that was uncomfortable. Really. I mean, there was other times, but I didn't really do it by choice. This is where I deliberately chose something that was uncomfortable because staying in that relationship, I didn't just stay for this reason. I stayed because we had such a great relationship and a foundation and it was a lot of things I love. But also, I was choosing discomfort because I knew if I stayed that this was gonna mean I was gonna change, and that's what I did. So we stayed, I ended up setting some goals for myself. I got certified in different things. I did, like, the Tony Robbins seminars. I got certified in neuro-linguistic programming as a life coach. I went to all these different things. I got certified as a Wim Hof Method instructor, and it just kinda snowballed. It was like the results I was seeing in my life and considering where I started to where I got into, I was like, shit, if I can change, I think anybody can change.
Mhm.
And that's where I just decided, this is where I want to help other people achieve the same thing. And then I had all these different tools and I just kind of molded them into my business to, use them to help other people experience the same kind of change I had went through.
How did the two of you meet when you were seemingly in such different places in your life at that
We
point?
met, yeah, funny enough, we met on Tinder,
All
which
right.
people don't ever expect that. But honestly, I was living in Toronto at the time. She was in Ottawa. And a lot of my family lived in Ottawa, so this was still my big party days, and I didn't expect anything to come of it. We met so I was in Ottawa, I was on Tinder, we matched, or whatever, if you've
Yeah.
been on Tinder, you know what that means, and we hadn't met, so I think it was a really good thing because she actually it was near it was around Christmas time, and she lost her phone, and so
Mhm.
I thought she just, ghosted me.
Yeah.
And so I didn't hear from her for a while, and then eventually I got a message on Facebook, which was in my hidden messages because we weren't Facebook friends, so it took me a while to get to it.
Mm.
And then we just started chatting. And so I'm actually very grateful that we hadn't met before that because things could have been a lot different. But then we just had developed this genuine communication and genuine relationship, just talking back and forth for a long time over Facebook. And then eventually, I came back to Ottawa. We just went for coffee, and the rest is history.
That's
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it could have been so easy for that to turn out differently as well, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I'm very not familiar with the whole online dating scene. I had the fortunate luck to meet my now husband when I was only 19, so
Oh, wow.
that was way before the Tinder and app days. We met the old-fashioned way in a bar, so
Oh, really?
yeah,
Nice.
yeah,
That
but
is the old-fashioned way. I love
Uh-huh.
that.
But yeah, just based on the stories I hear from friends, to me, it seems like there's almost like such a game, being
Oh,
played, right? Oh, you have to wait a certain amount of time, days before you message the person. So I can see how thinking that you were ghosted by her, even kind of ignoring her message at some point. But
it
but you,
plays with your mind.
yeah, yeah, but you made the choice to
Yeah.
to continue the conversation once you got that Facebook message.
Yeah, it was honestly, it was actually, I think more than anything at the time, it was like a confirmation because like you get ghosted by somebody, and especially somebody like me who lives so heavily for validation of others, even up until that point, getting ghosted was like a hit to my ego. So then when I got that message from her, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm not all bad. So
Yeah.
people do like me.
So you mentioned as you were going through this path, taking a lot of personal development courses, and now you teach a lot of these courses as well. And that's actually how we met. So
Nice.
Reform hired you to lead a Wim Hof workshop for some of us trainers. And yeah, do you want to just quickly go over what Wim Hof is to those who may not know what it is?
Yeah. So Wim Hof, obviously the method is named after him. He also goes by the nickname the Iceman. So he's been known forever to be like this superhuman type of person who can withstand like sub-zero temperatures for long periods of time. And the way he kind of built or his name was through a lot of these challenges of like longest ice bath in the world. He climbed Mount Everest past the death zone in just his shorts. He climbed Kilimanjaro in record time in just shorts, like all these different cold exposure type things. But he, along with cold exposure, he created this breath work to go along with it. And this method kind of came out of it, which includes cold exposure, breath work, and mindset training. And really, it's one of the most simple things to implement into one's life, but it's one of the most profound things that I've ever heard of or ever met. Because when you practice this method, it influences so many different systems within your body. It influences your endocrine system, your nervous system, your immune system, your circulatory system, your mental state, your entire breathing mechanism, like and there's more. So all within just a very simple cold exposure and breath work. All these different things are getting worked. And the real reason I started sharing this was just because of the profound benefits I had seen so many people around the world experience, including myself. And then they added on, they basically do all these different scientific research on the method specifically. And it's just been shown to have just profound effects on human physiology and your overall health. And so it was a no brainer for me to share this with other people just because I know how healing it can be.
Mhm. Throughout these workshops and some of the coaching things that you do working with other people, do you have any big transformation stories that you can share about how people were able to kind of like shift their mindset and get out of those boxes they put themselves in?
Yeah. So, in terms of my workshops, I see somebody once and then I often don't see them again, which actually is a really good thing. Anybody who helps people, that's kind of the goal is you never have to
Mhm.
see them again. And so there's countless people who would either hate the cold and now they love it. And these effects have trickled into whether it's their work life, their personal lives, where not only do they have more energy, stress reduction, all these different things, but the other things that it's really helping with is not only people's mindset, but there are people who have, specifically with autoimmune disorders. So, what the Wim Hof method does, it helps to balance your immune system and reduce inflammation in your body.
Mhm.
And we never say this is a cure for anything because it's very subjective, if it's very individual, the experience and the benefits somebody's going to have from this. But they've done specific studies on autoimmune, so people with a certain arthritis that affects the pelvis and the lower back. And we've seen in that study that when they added the Wim Hof method, had amazing results to basically reduce their medication and experience a lot of relief and pain and whatever and so on. But the amount of people I have had come through workshops and also people I meet at these expeditions and retreats who not only autoimmune, but people with diabetes, people with different cancers, people with, you know, really, really it comes down to inflammation. So it's fairly widely accepted that all illness and disease comes down to inflammation at the root. And so just the amount of people that I have met who attribute the Wim Hof method to helping relieve some of their pain or even reduce their medication, have more energy, whatever the case may be, is astonishing. Like I can't even begin to explain the amount of people who have found relief with the Wim Hof method in that case.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Now, yeah, do you think a lot of that has to do with like the cold exposure, or is it the breath work that gets
So
taught, combination of both?
they actually did a study specifically on this. So they studied the Wim Hof method and they wanted to know because forever we've heard that cold exposure helps or ice baths help with, anti-inflammatory response. And that's why a lot of athletes will do it after a big game or something, right? To reduce the inflammation. So we've all heard that. And then also through some studies on the Wim Hof method, we learned how powerful the breath work is. It's actually been shown that there's multiple things happen, one being the release of adrenaline, the second being release of different metabolites that help influence anti-inflammatory proteins in the body when we do the breath work. And so we know that there's inflammatory properties in both. But then the question came up, okay, is it more in the breath work? Is it more in the cold or is it both? So what they found was the cold exposure on its own doesn't have a lot of anti-inflammatory properties. And just as a side note, anybody who's an athlete, you're better off waiting 6 to 8 hours, 4 to 6, 6 to 8 being safe, but at least 4 hours after exercise before you do cold exposure. Because one, you want that natural inflammatory response to happen. And second, it basically, in a less scientific way, affects your gains you're going to have in terms of muscle growth after exercise. And so the anti-inflammatory properties of cold exposure only accounts for about 15% of what we used to think. All of the benefits of recovery from cold exposure come from the cold shock protein and recovering and basically cell regeneration through that. And again, it's best at least 4 hours after exercise. Now, so they studied this. So they saw that there wasn't that much anti-inflammatory properties going on with the cold exposure. They found that the breath work, still, as we already knew, has a lot of anti-inflammatory properties to it. And then they found when you actually combine the two in your daily practice, you have the most. So to give you a really summarized answer, the breath work is the most powerful in terms of anti-inflammatory, but both combined is even more powerful. And that's
Is
not
it a
to
lot
say
more
that
powerful combining the 2?
that's hard to say. I love doing both. I understand people have reservations about the cold. So if you're not ready for the cold, then you're going to be just fine doing the breath work.
Mhm.
And
Okay.
that's not to say we're talking about these anti-inflammatory benefits. That's not to say there aren't a ton of other benefits with the cold, but specifically anti-inflammatory isn't what we used to think it was.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah.
That's good to know. Yeah. Just because when I was taking the workshop, the cold bath actually wasn't as bad as I was expecting it to be.
Mm,
But for me, it's more just the convenience of how do I do this on a regular basis? Whereas the
yeah.
breath work, yeah, that can be more easily done on a daily basis.
Yeah. I think almost all of the studies done on cold exposure are on immersion. So that's where you have water up to your shoulders.
Mhm.
Now, a great second option that isn't as studied, but we know there are still benefits, are cold showers, which is
Yeah.
much more accessible to a lot of people. Basically, if you can do a cold shower a day, and I don't mean that you have to go into the cold for a minute or 2 minutes. If basically what is accessible to you, you do a warm shower, then you do cold for 30 seconds, then go back to warm, you're going to have benefits. You're going to lose some of the metabolic benefits that go along with that, but you're still going to have other benefits in terms of cold exposure.
Mhm. Another thing I remember about doing that ice bath during the workshop with you is that so the maximum amount of time was 2 minutes.
Mm,
And I think it was like for the last 20 seconds or so. Like I was sitting with my arms and shoulders outside of the water. And then I think for the last 20 seconds or so, you asked me if I could handle going down a little bit more so that it was just my head was above the water. So what kind of things do you look at in order to recognize whether or not somebody is able to kind of like push themselves a little bit further?
There's it's mostly just the physical indicators. If somebody I can visibly see is in stress, I can measure how much you're breathing. If you're breathing a lot, it means that you're going through a bit of a stress response. So if I can tell that you have a pretty regular breath, I would ask you to do that. And that's pretty much it. When we look at ice baths, and this is not to take away again from anything, like going into a freezing cold ice bath is challenging, very challenging.
Mhm.
But what happens if you go into an ice bath and you stay in there and you experience what I call the transition? So you initially are pretty panicked in general. Some people don't get out of that panic state because their mind goes on overdrive. But for I'd say 99% of the people who come to workshops, I can get them from being panicked to being calm, which is that transition place where they go from, okay, this is stressful, it hurts, I don't like it, to then relaxing their breath and being able to be in the cold. And basically, with cold exposure, you want to get to the point where you're always doing it safely. The water is cold. You have the thought like, yeah, I would like to get out, but I can stay in safely. And so that's where you want to get to. Now, when you go into an ice bath, what happens once you relax and you reach that kind of transition point, you develop a protective barrier around your body. And so what happens is the skin temperature of or the your skin temperature equalizes with the temperature of the water. And it actually eventually becomes fairly easy for people to be able to sit there for longer periods of time because nothing is moving. They're very still. And so when I ask people to then move and to get more under the water, what I'm also doing is having them increase, they're going to release more epinephrine or adrenaline in this case, and they get more benefits out of that.
Mhm.
And it makes it more challenging. So when we do cold exposure, to me anyway, cold showers I hate are very challenging.
Yeah.
But that's because you have so much air moving around you, you don't develop that protective barrier. But then getting into, some places like one place actually in Ottawa, Nobility Performance, I don't know if you heard of them. They're in Stittsville.
No.
They have a cold plunge, and in their cold plunge, they have jets. And so the water is always moving, which is really good because you want that for added benefit. And that way, you also don't need to stay in as long if you don't want to, because
Mhm.
you have more benefits sooner that way. And the same thing. So if you're in an ice bath, if I can get you to move, or if you are doing it on your own and you're moving around a little bit, you're going to develop more adrenaline. And
Mhm.
then, kind of the top tier of difficulty, I would say, is getting into, dipping in nature in a river because the water is moving. Obviously, you always want to be safe, have somebody there with you. Don't go where the current is strong. There's a whole bunch of safety parameters around this, and I don't advise anybody to do it unless you're specifically trained to dip in nature. But that would be probably the hardest one because not only are you outside in the elements, but the water is also moving. And so to, to circle back to your question, I basically take note of how the person is handling the cold based on their breath and their physical expressions and things like that. And I would get them to go in deeper just to get some movement happening and to kind of enhance the benefits a little bit and to challenge themselves a little bit more.
Yeah. So earlier you were talking about the steps of growth being awareness, acceptance, and action. And that was another post that I caught on your Instagram page. And on your post itself, there was a fourth step, which is repeat. And to me, lately, something that I've been thinking about is how to be uncomfortable. Sometimes you have to kind of, be able to sit with yourself and do nothing, right? And that action can sometimes be not necessarily doing anything, right? And I find that also the repeat process is something that people struggle with. And I don't know if it's just people's lack of attention spans these days with the amount of information that we were exposed to, but I think people just kind of get bored with repeating the same thing over and over again. But sometimes to achieve growth, it's, you know, having to do the things that or repeating the behaviors that will move you forward on a regular basis over time, right? So it's that discipline to do that breath work that you do on a daily basis. And that's kind of what will help lead you along that growth process. It doesn't just happen because you started to, jump into an ice bath one day. It's that repetition and constantly putting yourself under those uncomfortable situations that kind of build your resilience and mental toughness overall.
I would say one of the things is that when we set a goal, we get a big shot of dopamine. It
Mhm,
feels good to set goals. Doing the work, don't get that same shot when we actually sit
mhm,
down to meditate and to do the work. If I today make my plan for tomorrow and I say, okay, I'm going to meditate first thing in the morning, then I'm going to read 20 pages, I'm going to listen to a podcast, I'm going to do my breath work. That all feels good. Those goals, I'm getting dopamine right in that moment setting those goals. To do it, we don't get that. And that's part of the reason why it's so challenging. And, I think we need to be mindful that growth is a lifelong process. And that's where the repeat comes in. And that's what I mean by it. It's like we develop awareness about a part of ourselves, we accept it, we take action. Maybe we want to improve this part of ourselves or whatever the case may be. It could even be that, as simple as we're aware that we aren't at the level of fitness we want to be in. So then we have to really accept that and be true to ourselves. Okay, like this is where I'm at. This is a realistic spot where I'm at, and I need to take action to improve that. And that's going to be uncomfortable to get because you're going to probably spend long hours at the gym. You're going to maybe have to change your nutrition. All these things are going to happen that are out of your discomfort zone, right? Or out of your comfort zone, in your discomfort zone. And then maybe down the road, you develop awareness of something different that you want to change about yourself. Like growth is a lifelong process. And part of the issue is that in today's day and age, we are very used to or we seek instant gratification.
mhm,
And if you think about it, growth happens over long periods of time. So it goes directly against how we're being programmed right now for instant gratification. And so to sit down, and you were absolutely right when you said sometimes doing something is actually not doing anything at all. I often say less is more. And sometimes we need to just not be doing so many things because we are always keeping ourselves busy. Meditation is one of the most profound and powerful things you'll ever do in your life. I can guarantee you that. And that's pretty much not doing anything at all. You're just sitting there.
yeah.
And I mean, among other things, and bring awareness, and there's definitely protocols that you can use to meditate. But simply put, you're basically sitting in silence. And so, since we've been kind of programmed to go through or to be, seeking instant gratification because we always want those shots of dopamine, every time we pull up our phone and we're scrolling things, we're getting dopamine hits and everything else, and we get it all over the place. So that when we aren't getting it, it's like, oh, we need to get back to it. We're addicted to it, right? And so, I think that if we bring more awareness to that and truly accept that growth is going to be a long process, it's maybe a bit easier to get on board with doing some of these things when we already know that the road is going to be a bit longer. But I just think
Mhm,
that so many of us aren't aware that this is going to take some time, or at least we aren't realistic with ourselves.
mhm.
Tony Robbins often says this quote. He says, we overestimate what we can do in a year and we underestimate what we can do in 10 years,
Yeah.
right? In a year, like to do some really profound growth, depending on the situation, this is very context based and subjective, but it doesn't happen overnight and by any stretch of the meaning of that.
I see that a lot with clients coming in to see us. A lot of times we get people wanting to lose weight, for instance. Yeah, they get frustrated because nothing happens after 2 months or something,
Yeah.
right? And it's like, how long did it take for you to get to this stage? It's not some easy fix, no matter how many Instagram influencers say otherwise.
That's right. I think there's a big disconnect there between expectation and reality that going on,
Mhm.
and not only you're right with weight loss, but with just everything, everyday life. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's just be patient.
hmm
All right. Any last words or pieces of advice for people before we wrap up today?
I think we nailed a lot of really important things. I think it was, a great conversation, which I really appreciate. So thank you very much for that. I I don't think I have anything else to say. I think it's just really important to reiterate the two main things is that we need to seek discomfort and we have to be realistic with the time frame that growth happens in and that
Mhm.
healing a lot of growth is actually healing. Like I said, we all carry trauma from our past, and so healing also takes time, and we have to have that grace with ourselves because otherwise we judge ourselves, we have shame, and it just makes everything a lot worse.
Mhm. All right. Well, thanks a lot for chatting with me, Jacob.
Yeah.
So where can people find you if they want to hear more about you?
Yeah, you can find me on social media. So my main account is I am Jacob Mark on Instagram. And you can find me at my website, jacobmark.com. And yeah, those are the main two spots.
Mhm. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely recommend giving Jacob a follow on Instagram, if not only to see the beautiful scenery of his nature.
Yeah. Oh, I love those
there's some
tips.
there's
Yeah.
some pretty cool shots that you got there.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, they're a lot of fun. Well,
Mhm.
they're uncomfortable, but they're fun.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, cool. Well,
All right.
thanks so
Cool.
much. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah. Thanks for being on.